Genesis. This is the second time we have live Bibled through Genesis, because probably about 10 pages have changed since last time. And by changed, I mean have been added or majorly modified. I think 7 or 8, maybe even more, have been directly added. So I think it's about time we get back to this. Genesis 1. To start with, we have the creation myth, right? Which even when I was originally writing this, even before I originally wrote this, I was taught in kind of like a Judaic, like after-school program, from multiple after-school programs through my childhood, my Jewish childhood. Not like super Jewish, but like still pretty Jewish. You know, no pork, no meat with cheese, that sort of stuff. I was taught, yeah, no, the whole Genesis thing, it's not literal. It didn't really happen, right? It's more of a fun story, is how I was taught as a kid. People nowadays kind of don't treat it as fun story, mostly, from what I, encounter when talking with people, but more, oh, it's a metaphor for something else. Or, oh, no, it's not like literally a garden, it means heaven, right? Which you could say is also metaphorical. That sort of stuff, right? It's generally not considered to be a truth at this point in time anymore. Now, of course, there are still devoted Bible literalists, like young earth creationists, who still insist that this is the direct truth, that Genesis is more reliable than science. However, not all that long ago, these sort of views were widespread. And I link an interesting Wikipedia article that talks about that controversy between science and religion, especially with Genesis. Now, to start off with kind of that metaphorical thinking, I've heard people try to abstract away the concept of days. And even if this is true, if this is what's meant to be said, that days are truly, centuries or millennia or millions of years, that doesn't actually fix many of the problems. Because I can say, okay, sure, it's not literal days, why not? I see no reason why I should interpret them that way. I see no reason other than, scientific sense. However, even if this were to be the case, and we were to go and say, yeah, no, these are not literal days, the order that things happen, and also the way things happen, is demonstrably untrue. Or at least, if they were true, the God who did all these things then hid it all and gave us a myriad, so much conflicting evidence. He made a reality one way and then completely buried it intentionally, which seems like a very nonsensical, dishonest thing to do. And so I have no reason to believe that it occurred, and Occam's razor would dictate we take this explanation with least assumptions, which is just this is an incorrect mythological story. And all the scientific knowledge seems pretty reliable and can give us very strong predictions that are reliably true. So I'll go with that. So let's run with that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault, and separated water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. So firstly, God creates the heavens and the earth. But what exactly are the heavens, right? Because they can't be the sky, or let's say lump the atmosphere with that, as God makes that out of the ocean in the third paragraph. Perhaps the night sky, perhaps space. Let's be as charitable as possible to modern scientific knowledge and say space, or in respects to scientific knowledge. Kind of the opposite. So then the first thing God does is to make the space, the universe and Earth. The Earth is also covered in water, or perhaps, right, perhaps this is not the Earth, but we can see, the way this is written, now the Earth is formless and empty, darkness overshadows the deep, implies the deep is part of Earth, right? So why is the Earth covered in water? Now, interestingly, this idea of the primordial sea is actually very common with mythology, and we'll get to that later. But from just an ontological perspective, ignoring mythological influences, it doesn't really make sense. Why is there water randomly? God didn't make the water. But there's just water. There's already water. Now, the universe is 13.7 billion years old. Well, the Earth is only, about 4.543 billion years old. Only after the Earth does God make day and night. The sun, of course, is what runs day and night. The sun is 4.6 billion years old, older than the Earth. Now, e.g., the sun is something I've actually gotten pushback on. Like, hey, it's possible that no, the day and night just kind of worked on their own as an idea of light. Because what we're actually going to see later, very soon, is God's going to create the sun explicitly. And I think I'll talk about this when we get to there. Now, Earth was formed from the dust and the gas left over from the sun. And so, obviously, Earth can't come first. We can't have the Earth created from a sun that doesn't exist yet. And for the first 100-odd million years after formation, the Earth was under barrage by large quantities of asteroids, some of which were likely what brought water to the planet. At one point, Earth even collides with another planet, I think it's like a Mars-sized planet off the top of my head, leading to the formation of the Moon. So the order and the mechanics of the creation of the Earth are already, obviously, utterly wrong. And also, God makes the sky out of this pre-existing, primordial, globe-spanning ocean, which just exists. Besides that, the sky, made of water, is flatly preposterous, scientifically speaking. But going back to Occam's razor, taking the assumption that seems simplest and has the least assumption, what ancient cultures may have done is they've gone, okay, well, here's this blue thing, this ocean, it's very blue, and it's full of water. And we look in the sky, we see a very similar large blue surface, and sometimes water comes from there. And they see this dome, they look in the sky and you can see the sky as a dome if you really look for it. Kind of, or maybe that's just me getting some placebo. But you can look up and you can see, yeah, that looks like a dome. You can see like the clouds curve over. And the people would go, okay, well, there's a dome and there's water above the dome. And then sometimes the dome opens and that's where the water comes from. And so it makes sense why you have ideas like the floodgates of heaven. Why we have water being separated from water here. Only if we read this from the point of these are people who do not know how things work and just make an assumption. They're giving an explanation, like Zeus with his thunderbolts. But back to scientifically speaking, which is very grammatically correct, this is so backwards that at the Earth's onset, all water would have been housed in the atmosphere, not a deep ocean, in a vaporous form, and the only oceans would be those of magma, not water. And here's an article on the formation of the Earth. Thoughts so far? Think that's enough?
I think pretty cool.
Cool. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Now this is vague enough that I personally can't dispute the formation of the continents. However, what I do find interesting is that God apparently called the ground land, the water seas. Now, I figured this could have been something with the translation from the original text, so I pulled up a Hebrew version, and no, it's just basically the same thing. It's claiming God named these things. It uses the word called, like the English one that's not name specifically in Hebrew, but it's the same meaning. So, not humans, but rather God himself comes up with the names, the words for land and sea. Maybe this is just in ancient Hebrew, or at least in ancient Hebrew, but why does God need language? Why would God have names for things? God can communicate pure thoughts, feelings, whatever he wants. God can communicate ways beyond our comprehension. In a perfect manner, God can communicate by his nature. He's all powerful, he's all knowing, he knows how to communicate perfectly, and he can communicate perfectly by his definition. Language is absolute trash when it comes to communication. Language is ridiculously easy to misinterpret people. Language cannot explain many concepts. Imagine trying to explain exactly where something is in like a 3D plane. I don't think 3D plane, 3D is plane, whatever. In a plane or a 3D environment with just your language. It's a harrowing task. Or try to explain an image perfectly. You can't do it realistically without going to some sort of basically an encoding algorithm at that point. Language is terrible. God has no need for such a terrible device like language. But you know who does? People do. And ignoring all that, if we have these divine names, why would every language not use these names? Especially since who is the one who creates languages in a biblical frame of view? It's God. And we'll get to that when we get to Babel. But just keep that in mind. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So, like I mentioned, God made day and night already. And to be fair to these verses, it's not saying that he's making day and night again. However, how do day and night work? They are directly the result of how the sun and the earth move around, right? It's the rotation of the earth spinning around its axis, and the seasons are based off the sun. But fundamentally, the sun is what lights the earth, giving us day, and the rotation of the earth is what gives us day versus night. As a shifting, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but the fact that it changes, how day goes to night and vice versa, that is the rotation of the earth, and the light is the sun. There is no other light of note. Of course, there's stars, which God also creates here, mind you, right? God makes the two great lights, the sun and the moon. The moon, of course, is not a light, but he then makes the stars at the same time. He also made the stars, verse 16, when he makes the sun and the moon. So my question is, where in the absolute universe is the light from Genesis 3 coming from? There's no sun, there's no moon, despite the fact the moon isn't a light, and there are no stars. The only conclusion I can draw is that the people of the time did not truly know how day and night worked, and so they saw that there was light everywhere. They didn't realize that necessarily the light was coming from the sun. They may have just envisioned a whole plane of just ambient light, and the sun was just one really big identifiable light. And at night, the light goes away, but there's still one light, one big light, the moon, and there's all the small lights, the stars. And that is the best explanation I have for why this is saying that these people just don't understand cosmology. However, I've heard some pretty paltry apologetics basically saying, well, no, God could have made a whole different system for day and night and then just instantly replaced it with no one to see it except for the plants. Which is like, why would he do that? Why would an all-knowing, all-powerful God need a temporary measure that he would pretty quickly replace? Why would God need a framework? He can pop things into existence. He incants things into existence across this whole chapter. So a temporary measure doesn't make sense in this context. Now, additionally, I mentioned the plants. God makes the plants before he makes, well, the sun, right? Unless we're going to argue the sun already exists and he just makes the sun again, right? And how do these plants properly survive without any way to photosynthesize? Let me just look at something here. I haven't seen the sky. Can I read this? Yeah, I'm going to correct that. I'm going to correct that. Whoopsies. That's actually silly. How? Well, that's dumb. Sun. How is this labeled in the document this long? That's a stupid mistake. Or maybe I'm just not reading it. No. You know, I'm so stupid. Yeah, this is actually very sad.
I think it's a result of like reading it again and then being like, I'm not sure if that's grammatically correct. I'll come back to it later, and that's just not.
No, it's just factually incorrect.
Oh.
For some reason, I thought the atmosphere was incorrect here. For some reason, maybe I'm just going insane or something.
Maybe you changed it and then didn't change that part.
It's possible that this was moved. That's possible, honestly. God makes these lights with very specific intent, bar, separating day from night, which he already presumably did when he made them day, made them light. He already seems to have done that, right? Beyond that separation, right? He already separated the light from darkness. He gave them the names day and night. He called them day and night, just like he called the land and sea, explicit names, which don't continue to be showing up in human language, unnecessary for the same reasons. However, beyond that meaninglessness, reasoning that we're being given here for why day and night are being now governed by these lights, to separate them. If anything, adding more light to both feels like it would get them closer to each other, because now they both have a big light. But that aside, notice how the sun and the moon are made to serve as signs for sacred times, to mark days and years. Why would they be doing this? Why is God marking sacred times when there's no people to have the times? This is putting the cart before the horse, and arguing that no, God intended all the holidays, all these other things, or God just intended the sun and moon to be used as consistent markers. Additionally, the sun and the moon are very much only something we as humans can use. This is a very human-centric belief system, human-centric, as opposed to what the aliens, well, we don't know if there's aliens. With such a large universe and presumably so much, so many livable planets out there, we've seen many that seem pretty Earth adjacent, and we've only seen such a small portion of the universe. It seems overwhelmingly likely that there's some life somewhere else. And yet, here we have God making the sun and the moon specifically for humans to use for their holy markings. And what this is a perfect example of people assigning prescriptive meaning to things, but not descriptive. They think that the sun and the moon were made for their markings, not that they used the sun and the moon as pre-existing, consistent facets of their life to mark these sacred events. Right? They're assigning meaning to something that fundamentally doesn't have meaning. And not they're saying that we can draw meaning from this. No, there's this meaning. This is why this is here. which is a very big difference in terms of the meaning you get from something. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every bird, every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds, and God saw that it was good. So, firstly, the marine animals and the birds come out together on, on this day. Now, that's weird, isn't it? That these two are coming out first before the land animals. Because if we know anything about evolutionary theory, the marine animals are the ones who come first by ridiculous amounts of time. In fact, like marine plants also predate, of course, terrestrial plants by similarly crazy degrees of time. And so one goes to wonder, why have all of these kind of birds and fish have, or more than just fish, of course. I'm going to say fish is kind of an umbrella term because I don't want to say marine animals constantly. Why have all these birds and these fish been placed, and also the bats and the insects as well? Again, I'm going to say birds, umbrella term, not accurate, but that's out of the way. Why are the birds and the fish coming out first? Maybe because the people who wrote this were people of the land. People don't fly. People don't live on the water, really. People live on the land. And so, and of course humans come last, so maybe they're viewed that these animals were closer to them than the birds were, the fish were. Either way, scientifically, the birds should be the last ones around because birds come ridiculously late of all the major groups of animals, right? Just go to like an elementary school science class, they'll tell you as much. Now, another very interesting thing is that God makes the livestock seemingly differently from wild animals. Now, this could be interpreted in a few ways. Either, domestication just didn't happen, they were already domestic, which we know is not true, or maybe a claim that these animals were, by their very nature, meant to be domesticated, easier to be domesticated, or maybe something else, right? Now, the one thing I want to notice is, again, wild versus livestock is a human idea. It's a human differentiation. And so it's just like the sun and the moon for the tracking of time, the dictation of ceremonies. It's not people use these things that were here. No, these things were made for people. A very, very big distinction. But either way, right, why do we even have this distinction, given that about 2-3 verses from now, God's going to claim that all animals are to be ruled over by humanity and tells them as much. So why do we have this distinction? But before we get to humans, before we get to people, let's talk about kinds. What exactly is a kind? You've seen this word with the animals, with the fish, with the birds, with the plants. Kind is an arbitrary classification, which is used by creationists, basically people, remember those Bible literalists I was talking about? That's what they're called. People who believe that God created things, hence creationists. And it's used to explain many of these massive wholes, or really a few of these, that science has poked in their worldview. To explain evolution, the overwhelming evidence of evolution, what we have is we have basically a distinction between microevolution, macroevolution. Microevolution is what is things like adaptation, like Darwin's finches. Like, no, they're still finches, but they have, different beaks. So it's only microevolution because it only changed a little bit. But macroevolution, speciation, in more sane terms, that's BS. Or at least the species are within a kind. A kind could be a genus, a kind could be a species, depends on the person. I think generally they set it more like a genus level characteristic, or maybe closer to whatever. I think it's family that's above genus. Or is it class? I think it's family. I think class is the fifth one. Regardless. But it's a bit vague, it's a bit arbitrary. There's no real mechanisms for how things are classified. Yeah, this is a panda. It's a bear. It's got bear in it. Oh, the elephants are all elephants. The beetles are all beetles, right? Which is just a bit weird. But fundamentally, they explain that these kinds don't ever deviate. So once you have a kind, you have that kind. There is no kind changing to another kind. If you've ever heard, you can't turn a giraffe into a monkey. That's talking about this idea. There's a giraffe kind, there's a monkey kind, and that it is insurmountable for one to shift to the other. Now, we don't see any idea of kind in this way in the Bible. We don't see this sort of thing. We just see kind as a general term referring to animals, like species, right? And it is said at some point, not in Genesis that I've read so far, where it says, animals cannot reproduce outside their kinds, which is sort of explaining the whole, kind is insurmountable genetic order, kind of adapting old language to fit new questions. And then this is a page on evolution by Answers in Genesis, one of the bigger creationists' sources, right? One of their main thing where they attack evolution is go, no. Mutations are always a loss of information. And if every mutation is losing information, well, eventually, you can't keep mutating because you lose all your information. And therefore, evolution can't go very far. Now, that's not true. There's duplication, there's modification. These, in terms of how the DNA replication errors occur. And there's, I'm not a scientist. I can, barely take a biology class, right? But there are scientists, and they've talked about this, and these are some very good videos I would highly recommend. And so again, what is a kind? It's a nonsensical definition, often grounded via reproductive ability, but generally reliant on appearance over anything of substance. And even then, accepting kinds, they kind of contradict arguments against evolution, like irreducible complexity. If you accept this argument, complex systems in different animals that share the same kind must have been intentionally designed by the creator and could not have been the result of an evolutionary process, as is advocated within kinds. But how can that work when we're told that the variety within individual kinds is not a direct result of God, but rather just the adaptation of the microevolutionary process? For example, the bombardier beetle it's pretty cool, actually. It's this basically a kind of clade, I don't know if clade's the term, I'm not a biologist, like I said, of beetles, kind of type of beetle, general overview, or segment of beetles that have acid that they basically propel out of an acid-proof tube to protect themselves. Now, bombardier beetles are presumably in the beetle kind, because they're beetles, it has beetle in the name, right? And other than the whole acid thing, there's nothing kind of super distinct from any other beetles that would have been placed into the beetle category. But they're kind of pointed at as one of the key examples of, hey, how could natural selection and random mutations have led to basically an acid shooter? And it's an interesting question, but what happens is not that, oh yeah, the beetle made acid and then just magically didn't die. No. What you probably had evolved is you had, is convergent evolution where things evolve together? I think that may be a different term. But I don't remember the term. Again, not a biologist. But things come one after another, but not as full systems, but as partial systems. For example, take the human eye, another very common example, in fact, more common than beetle, actually. I think. The idea with the human eye is creationists will go, okay, how could evolution have produced a human eye? Just one day, no eye, next day an eye? How would that happen? Well, that's not what happened. What you see is instead, if we look at the fossil record, we look at animals that are alive even now, we see a whole spectrum of eyes with very simple things. In, I think iguanas have them. They have a little patch of photosensitive cells above their head that let them detect basically changes in light, so they can see a shadow overhead. See is a strong word, but they can detect a shadow overhead like a bird of prey swooping in over them. That is useful, but that's not as complex as a human eye. It's very simple. And then that's useful though, so it's going to be kept. It's a useful thing for an organism to have, so it will be selected for through natural selection. Slightly more complex version of the eye is something like what we see in clams. They have incredibly simple eyes, little orbs of photosensitive cells. And then that's also useful. They can not very well, but they can see to an extent. And then it keeps going by the same idea. More things are kind of show up, and they're useful and they're kept, and then the eye keeps getting better and better and better. And it's not like the eye is perfect. I have glasses. I know you two have glasses, unless my memory doesn't work. Glasses, vision correction, blindness are things that we are dealing with because the eyes are not very well made. They function, they're very useful, but they show up as a result of random mutation, and that's why so many things within the human body are pretty bad from an engineering standpoint. And it's the same thing with the bombardier beetle, with how it would have evolved. And this was a very interesting article I read on it, which is why it's mentioned here. Now, with that tangent aside, right, let's get to another common argument about evolution. If we were to claim that God guided evolution, then the same case can be made for standard evolution disregarding kinds. Like, we don't need kinds at that point because then everything's God designed, right? Why not just toss them entirely? Noah's Ark, I think, is the reason we will get there. If God does guide evolution, he hardly rests after the initial creation, like we're told. And, smoking gun for that is at the end of Genesis 1. We're going to see, well, technically beginning of Genesis 2, is how it's organized. We're going to see, and that God finished his creation. It was done. Entirely done. And then he rests. Which doesn't seem to mesh with the idea of, oh yeah, God guided evolution, because then he's never stopped. Evolution still exists. It's observable in a lab. Right? And you're going to say God guided that. But even beyond that, evolution doesn't need a god. There's no reason to insert a god into evolution. Because what is evolution? It's random genetic mutation, many of which are harmful, some of which are not. A ton of them do absolutely nothing because they get ignored. And then the good things that help are preserved, and the bad things that don't help are very quickly gone because the individuals who got these bad mutations are dead. We don't need a god there. And furthermore, if evolution is God, divine, if it's set up by God, why is extinction a thing? Why are so many, I think 5 billion estimated species are extinct, and it's more like 8 some million estimated species are extant at the moment? What sort of intelligent design would it be to guide evolution to a way where so many of the creations are just dead? Why not just create things like the creationists would suppose? With all that out of the way, for the rest of this document, I'm just going to be reading kind as basically species, unless I'm stating otherwise. If you have any objections to this usage of the term, feel free to comment on that. That was long. Thoughts?
I mostly agree with it.
Mostly? Anything you disagree with?
No, sorry. Just mannerism speaking moment.
Gotcha, no worries. Because I don't
Yeah.
want to address anything like that. Or maybe I'm wrong, and I want to know about
Mm,
that. Like,
I mean,
you
I
guys
think
already
you're
saw
right.
me correct
When,
something that was
yeah, I think you're
insinuated.
right on your definition though,
Okay, thank you.
because it makes sense.
In terms of kind or species?
Yeah, yeah, at least to me.
Okay. Cool. And I somehow missed the whole Bible section. I was about to start reading. I'm like, wait, how did we get here? I'm blind. Okay. Speaking of the eyes being terrible, or I think it's more the brain. Regardless, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea," this was mentioned earlier, "and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." God claims that us, right? Us, some group, including God, will make mankind in their image. Perhaps angels, although seemingly God hasn't made them yet since they're never mentioned. And angels only show up a bit later. I think Genesis 16 is the first place we get explicit the word angel showing up. So I see no reason to believe these are supposed to be angels. But what I do find interesting is, of course, the source of God. And when I say God, I mean this biblical one. His name's Yahweh. Or, technically, that's just what we call him. It's Yud He Vav He in Hebrew, and we don't actually have the vowels anymore, which is how you get different pronunciations for God. Like, for example, Yehovah is not too far off from the Hebrew, neither is Yahweh. It's just gone from smushing the English consonants together. And so, yeah, we don't actually know his name, and we'll get to why, actually. But this is the general term for him. Now, he's pretty old, as gods go, or he's decently old, and was originally something like a war god and a storm god, specifically more violent storms, in a polytheistic religion, the religion of Canaan, which is it's called the Levant as well in more historical and theological areas, the area where Israel, Palestine are now. Now, and this is just from Wikipedia, in the oldest biblical literature, he possesses attributes typically ascribed to weather and word ease, fructifying the land and leading the heavenly army against Israel's enemies. The early Israelites were polytheistic and worshipped Yahweh alongside a variety of Canaanite gods and goddesses, including El, Asherah, and Baal, which we'll talk about soon. In later centuries, El and Yahweh became conflated, and El-linked epithets Baal also becomes conflated with El as well. But back to the quote. El-linked epithets such as El Shaddai came to be applied to Yahweh alone, and other gods and goddesses such as Baal and Asherah were absorbed into the Yahwist religion. But when did this polytheistic religion drop these other gods? And note, or I don't think it mentions, but something I want to note to you guys, is that these other gods are much older than Yahweh, which I think I do mention later. Towards the end of the Babylonian captivity, the existence of other gods was denied, and Yahweh was proclaimed, I can say words, the creator deity and sole divinity to be worshipped. During the Second Temple period, speaking the name of Yahweh in public became regarded as taboo, and the Jews instead began to substitute other words, primarily Adonai, my lords, and this is also just a respect term. Like in Hebrew, the term Adon, kind of like similar to sir to an extent, comes from the same root. It's not just a god thing, but it is generally used to refer to God. In Roman times, following the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of its temple in 70 CE, the original pronunciation of the god's name was forgotten entirely. So, before I keep going, I need some water. So I find it interesting how God is an adaptation of an ancient foreign sword god. If he was truly, a universal truth, then why would his perception shift like this? And what makes it even better is that Yahweh, kind of like I mentioned, wasn't the first of this pantheon. He wasn't the king of this pantheon, not for a while anyways. Instead, it was his father, El. The term El, Ohim, classically referred to El's pantheon. And this is now the Oxford Companion to World Mythology. It seems almost certain that the god of the Jews evolved gradually from the Canaanite El, who was in all likelihood the god of Abraham. If El was the high god of Abraham, Elohim, the prototype of Yahweh, Asherah was his wife, and there are archaeological indications that she was perceived as such before she was in effect divorced in the context of emerging Judaism of the 7th century BCE. See 2 Kings 23:15. Now, this also applies to the question of if there is a single true universal God, why are there other religions, faiths, spiritualities, what have you, who may share versions of the same figures, some with completely separate deities, and nearly all of which completely contradict each other? But back to that us. Parts of the Hebrew Bible were written in perhaps the 10th century BCE. The final redaction and canonization of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is called Pentateuch, most likely took place during the Babylonian exile, the 6th to 5th centuries BCE. The entire Hebrew Bible was complete by about 100 CE. The books of the New Testament were written in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. And a quick note, the Babylonian captivity and Babylonian exile are one and the same. There's 2 terms for same time frame when the Jews, Israelites technically that haven't really gone to Judaism yet, were conquered by the kingdom of Neo-Babylon and kind of taken to Babylon as captives, hence the term, hence the exile and captivity. Now, let's say there's about 4 to 5 centuries where Genesis could have been written with Yahweh either as a member of El's pantheon or some traditional transitional state as he merged with El to become, God, as it were. And we're gonna get to a bunch of different concepts and examples of stuff like this as we go through. But there's still many hints of this present in the Bible, even in this story. In fact, in this chapter, we've glossed over them because you can't see it in English. God's name, Yahweh, or here with the common spelling Yevah, right, in Hebrew, is not uttered once. Unlike most chapters, instead, the term Elohim, the gods, it's a plural term. Anything in Hebrew is actually plural, but it generally is used now and for much of what we can read to refer to just a singular. Although with this us, that's a bit of a hint right there. But Elohim is what we can see in Genesis 1. No Yahweh. And Yahweh shows up Genesis 2, right? He's basically there every single chapter name-wise. But Genesis 1, he is notably absent, right? And just for example, let me find one where it says Elohim. There's Elohim. Let's copy this. 32 mentions, right? Next chapter, Genesis 2, right? Still a lot, right? But notice now it's Yahweh, Elohim, right? Every time you see capitalized Lord in most Bibles, that's the name Yahweh. And then God is often Elohim or some other epithet for God. But let's copy Yahweh, right? How many times does it show up in Genesis 2? 11 times. Genesis 1, 0. Now, as I mentioned, Elohim is plural. The gods, a tense consistent with us and are the ones taking these actions. Although if we do look a second. Which verse are we on again? Oh, here we can see, here, this is now singular, actually. We see Elohim here, Betzelmo, right? That's not really plural. It can be used singularly. So that's why it's a his now. It's not in their own image, right? So it's a bit of a difference. So it could be this is the single creator deity, and these are the other ones he's talking to. Back to this anyways. Now, Elohim, as mentioned, El, Baal, as the previous quotes mentioned, El Shaddai, other epithets relating to Bel, are often used as just pseudonyms for the singular god Yahweh. And conceivably, this is actually just a retroactive change to explain away, hey, why were we all talking about El and Baal this time? Oh no, we're just talking about Yahweh, right? And we can actually see this in Genesis 6:3, which I probably mentioned later on. Well, I know I mentioned it later on, I don't know if I mentioned this chapter. Now, is that everything with this chapter? No, there's a lot. Remember how when the earth was created, I made a bit of a fuss about the fact that there were these primordial waters, this primordial deep over which God hovers.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Well, let's read an excerpt from some ancient Sumerian creation myths. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, in those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, and then the rest are just talking about all the other times, the gods and goddesses don't really care about that, senior gods oversaw the work, that sort of stuff. And then at that time, the one of great wisdom, the creator of all senior gods, Enki, lay on his bed, not waking from his sleep, in the deep Enger, the subterranean water. Right? So this is the time of when heaven and earth are created, and here is a water which the god lies in. There's just water, right? And so this section comes from the second section of the ancient Sumerian creation story. And the earliest known recording of this precedes the Hebrew Bible by something around a millennia. However, the religion clearly predates this text by quite a bit, so it's no stretch to presume that there were other older copies that probably just didn't survive. And Wikipedia is good on this topic. But notice that primordial water here. This goes deeper, though. In later Babylonian myth, the heavens and earth, and later from Sumeria, not later from the Bible, it predates that as well. The heaven and earth are made from the body of Tiamat, the goddess, the personification of the primordial sea, from whom heaven and earth themselves are fashioned. Something to note, however, the water of the deep, Enger, which Enki laid in, was actually not Tiamat herself, but a consort, Absu, from whom Enki creates his dwelling. And this is Enki in Babylonian myth, right? Because these gods were reused, kind of like how the Romans took from the Greeks. It's called syncretism. It's incredibly common with ancient religion. We can just trace most gods back a long time. And this is in the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian epic of creation. And like I mentioned, it also predates the Bible by a good deal. And, well, the Israelites would have definitely been in contact with this story because they were forcefully exiled to Babylon. And more parallels still exist when we look at the cosmological models proposed in this first story of Genesis, remembering that the vault God made, well, do you remember that vault? Separating water from water, the sky and the seas?
Mhm.
That's also referred to as the firmament in other Bible translations. And scholarly consensus is this is a dome over the earth. Here's a bit of a diagram. So here's heaven, the top, and there's the upper seas and the great deep. These are the seas that have been separated, right? And we have other things that are going to show up later. But here's the firmament, that divider, and we have the floodgates of heaven over here. I could have sworn they were marked on this map. But that's what these holes are. They're where the rain comes through, right? And something else, if we actually look at these sort of ancient Near Eastern ideas, the sun and the moon were kind of just on the dome. They were kind of just tacked on there. They kind of moved around. Not the Earth moves around the sun moves around the Earth, as most people thought. Heliocentrism was a thing for a long time. And this is now about 3,000 years ago, or however much longer this oral tradition that predated this would have gone for. Right? So these are very prevalent ideas around the science. And again, this matches the ancient Sumerians and their ideas. The Sumerians, and this is Wikipedia now, the Sumerians envisioned the universe as a closed dome surrounded by a primordial saltwater sea. Underneath the terrestrial Earth, which formed the base of the dome, existed an underworld and a freshwater ocean called the Absu. We mentioned him. The deity of the dome-shaped firmament was named An. That of the earth was named Ki. First, the underground world was believed to be an extension of the goddess Ki, but later developed into the concept of Kerm. The primordial saltwater sea was named Namu. This is Sumerian, Namu, who later developed, who became known as Tiamat during and after the Ur 3 period. Ur is a very important city. We're actually going to see it in Genesis 12. It's going to be mentioned. It's going to be mentioned after that point as well. Some ancient Sumerians believed that salt and other minerals were alive and could think independent thoughts. Kind of irrelevant, but it's part of the snippet. Clearly, we can see this story, rather than being divinely inspired, is rather mundanely inspired, actually. Right? And just like I mentioned, as the Romans took from the Greeks, among others, not just the Greeks, the Romans took from all over, the ancient Israelite, in fact, actually, quick aside, the story of Romulus and Remus actually has quite a few mirrors, a few parallels we can draw to the story of Cain and Abel, interestingly enough, like the brother killing the brother, the creation of a great city by the brother who killed the other one, that sort of stuff. Actually, kind of interesting. So it's possible that was also taken, because of course Rome is a while after ancient Judaism. Just interesting things to consider. Off topic though. The ancient Israelites were clearly borrowing from ancient Sumerian and Babylonian ideas, among others. We'll get into that sort of stuff. Like Zoroastrianism is also, there's some themes in Zoroastrian dualism that we're going to see in Genesis 4. And this is, kind of like I'm mentioning right now, this is hardly the last time we're going to see such a parallel with actually some of the most blatant borrowing coming later. Thoughts?
Sure.
Cool. So the Bible claims here that humanity is made in God's image. So does God have an appendix with tailbone, wisdom teeth, the tendon, longus even? Now you might be wondering, what in the world is the tendon longus? That sounds silly. But the tendon longus is pretty interesting. If you flex your hand kind of backwards, let me get a picture of it actually. Tendon longus. No, I don't. All right, there's a bunch of them actually. It's a base term. I need to update that. Hand. Palmaris longus. Oh, can't believe I never corrected that. Whoopsies. Whoopsies. These old sections are making me sad. Okay, so the Palmaris longus, that's the one I'm talking about on the hand. Can I, like, Get like a real picture? Okay, cool. It's this thing. If you flex your hand, you might be able to see it. You might not. And why might you not be able to see it? Well, 14% of the world's population is missing this. I think up to 65% in certain local populations. And, well, I mean, does God have one of those? Are those humans not in God's image, the ones who either have or don't have it? I mean, as you go back in time, I think there's more and more of them, right? And it's a more modern mutation because it's a useless tendon. It's so useless even that like doctors will literally just cut the tendon out and use it as material to replace other tendons, right? And you could say, oh yeah, God just knew that was going to be the case, but then why is it going away? Because there's no selection pressure. Why would it go away once it starts being useful? It's very weird for planning, and for most of history, utterly useless. And also in the future, we're going to have artificial tendons anyway, so it's going to be useless then as well. And what about all the various mutations that have happened? Like, is God lactose intolerant? That's a mutation. That's only in a small part of the population. I mean, of course it can't be, because he's all powerful. And finally, this is the question everyone's asking: does God have a foreskin? I mean, he must if we are made in God's image. Men, because I mean, men wrote the Bible. And when I say that, I don't mean humans, I mean men. The Bible is incredibly male-centric, and we'll see that, and we'll keep seeing that as we keep going through. Right? When they say God made mankind, and it's right there, right? In God's image, probably they mean men. Maybe mankind, man and woman. But if we look at Adam and Eve, who's made first? Adam. And who's an afterthought? Eve. And we'll get there. So, back to the foreskin. If God has a foreskin, or his form that he enjoys taking as a foreskin, because if God has an image, he must have some sort of physical form that he takes. And he does walk around in multiple occasions. He does go places physically. He's also everywhere at once. Bit of a weird, how does that work? But he's all powerful. Like, maybe he just condenses himself into a physical form, but while still maintaining presence everywhere else. I don't really go into that. I can accept that from the powerful God, honestly. But if God's form is perfect, why does he command us to destroy a perfect form? We've already discussed how human form is terrible when it really comes down to it, with how, in terms of functionality at least, does God simultaneously have a male and female form, or are the males solely made in God's image, seeing as, well, like I said, the Bible's from a very male-centric point of view? But some people say, no. When people say, when the Bible says it was made in God's image, that doesn't mean like people as like literally visually were made in God's visual image, but rather the pattern of human mind, human behavior, was made in God's image. But here's the fun thing about that. We're going to keep seeing, even before the New Testament, we're going to see a bunch of all the people are evil from childhood. They deserve to be killed. This sort of hatred of the human self, of the human heart, in a metaphorical sense, not like literally, right? It doesn't seem to really match with the idea that we were made in God's image. If people say God cannot sin, and yet the humans can. Clearly the human psyche wasn't very much made in God's image, because it lets us do something that God would never do, or could never do. So that doesn't really make sense, so I'd have to conclude physical image, or maybe a combination of the two, but not entirely in his image. Feels like a bit of a nothing statement. And again, this is sort of one of those prescriptive things I've been pointing out across this chapter. If we look at gods, right, this is what's called the argument for locality, part of it anyways. We look at gods, they don't have their cultures mirror them, they mirror their cultures. And we could see that because the god of modern Christianity, most of it anyways, is not the same God of Christianity 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Keep going back to the ancient Jews, the Jews versus Christians, they don't worship the same God. Same in terms of like, yeah, it's from the Bible, but there's many differences. There's many things that they disagree on. There's, what is it, 2,000 or 30,000, many thousand sects of Christianity, all presumably worshiping the same God, but willing to sentence the others to hell. So, there is not a one true God that anyone can really see. We instead have so many gods, and what do these gods all have in common? These gods just about perfectly fit the wants of the people or the society that they're a part of. So many gods, ancient gods, have this tribalistic idea of a chosen people or a preferred group. And they always happen to be the people who worship the god. Imagine if Moses came down from the mountain. Instead of going, we are God's chosen people, he went, the Egyptians were God's chosen people. He wants us to go back in slavery. Or he goes, oh, no, the Philistines, another group that the Israelites have problems with across the Bible, are God's chosen people, and we're going to go serve them. No religion does that, really. None of the really successful ones, anyways. Evolution is not just a physical thing, it's a cultural thing. And religions evolve. The concepts of gods and even God evolve. We're not made in God's image. God is made in ours. And just kind of leaving that on the back burner, since we're talking about human design anyways, here's the fun kicker. God claims, or the Bible states, that God creates humans male and female. However, even disregarding gender, right, this just isn't true. Intersex people, exist, right? And again, I am not a biologist, and this is more complex than like basic evolutionary theory, which, I kind of flubbed, I think. I know, though, for example, that XY chromosomes can occasionally correspond to female genitalia, vice versa, genitalia from both, and a bunch of other possibilities. And I link an article that explains this, does much better justice than I can ever hope to, right? The whole idea of sex is really a man-made term, and in more scientific means really just describes gonad configuration. And what people would have said male and female was just this person looks male, this person looks female, and those are of course cultural gender norms. Again, I said to avoid gender, so just from a biological perspective, sex is, while it's mostly there's two piles people fall into, it's more of a spectrum, right? It's just really the determination of gonads, and I'm going to read this now. Primary sex determination is the determination of the gonads. In mammals, primary sex determination is strictly chromosomal and is not usually influenced by the environment. In most cases, the female is XX, the male is XY. Notice the in most cases. Every individual must have at least one X chromosome. Since the female is XX, each of her eggs has a single X. But, like I said, in reality, right, as this says, it's not, there's most cases, there's a spectrum here. And, the vast majority of that spectrum is categorizable into male and female. And these simple boxes were drawn around nature. And I know there's like a great quote, but it's not coming to me, but basically going along the lines of, nature is messy. Science wants to be very clean, wants to categorize things, and one of those things is, of course, human sex. Species. That's why there's a lot of very blurry lines in how species are really, what's this species, what's male, what's female. There's a lot of very blurry lines in science. But, with a very basic overview, it seems like everything's clear and set in stone. That's not really the case. Now, I also kind of like the interesting idea of how God basically indirectly says, he says increase in number, fill the earth. How do humans do that? Sex. How do you fill the earth? Do a lot of sex. And that really does make chastity, celibacy, even kind of the concept of marriage, right, as only this one person, kind of interesting as religious concepts. Like, hey, fill the earth as much as you can, but like only like after you've done this ceremony and like this person and don't do it when you like not pledge, and there's all these rules around it. And it's very interesting how these two ideas seem to contradict. And I said I'd probably circle back to this, but I have not for the next 20 some chapters. So, or I may have mentioned it, but I don't know if I will ever find a really like nice answer to why or how these two ideas seem to contradict. But maybe I will, and then I'll go back and change this. And then God said to the humans, right? Yeah, we're going back to the Bible. It's only been like 30 minutes. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give the green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Now, I think every is a strong word. Seeing how God gets rather annoyed later about a particular tree, right? And God does not really like his creation in the end, right? God has been saying this whole time, ending just about every single day with a near identical declaration that things are good. Clearly, he's happy with his creation, and because he's all-knowing, it's future. But this stands in stark contrast to how God frequently gets upset at the actions of creations and explicitly regrets what he has done here, not just for the humans, but for the animals as well. And this is technically Genesis 2, but it's the Genesis 1 story, so we're going to wrap up with this. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, like this is what I was talking about at the beginning. How is evolution? God guided it to be completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, and so on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So that's Earth, right? Wondering why the bacteria and parasites aren't mentioned? Because I wouldn't really classify them as, birds, fish, or, land animals, crawlers of the land. I guess you could classify parasites in various categories, but bacteria, I would say, are entirely different. Don't really fall into any of those categories. Now, I've heard it argued that these only came into play after original sin, even though there's nothing in the text referring to them, and things like disease are referred to as the result of demons at later points. But there's nothing really talking about this, but I will get to that later, probably at the end of Genesis 3. I think is where I do that. I also find it very bizarre that God needs to rest, seeing as infinite power and all, any quantity of work should not tire him out, or to put it in more simple terms, x over infinity is equal to 0, no matter what x is. So even if God puts a billion, newtons of force into something, he's still used 0 relative to himself of his overall power, energy, what have you. And the Bible actually does agree with me here, saying God never gets weary or tired. So the question of why is he resting is a very big one. Cool. So that's Genesis 1 then. And we will get to more of the origin anthropology stuff of God in Genesis 2, which we will do I think tomorrow. Any last questions this time? I said I would go through this fast, but that was over an hour.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I'll throw my hat in the ring for why he takes rest on the seventh day.
Sure.
Maybe I'm thinking of one of two reasons. Maybe just either boredom or like admiring what he's done.
Boredom. How could God be bored, or how can he not be bored? I figure, given an all-knowing, all-powerful God, if he didn't want to be bored, he could just simply choose not to be. Right? That would have to be a kind of want to be bored. And compared to God, whatever's happening is, well, a zero, as we've already mentioned. Anything with infinity is compared to a zero. So no matter what's happening, it should be similarly entertaining to him. Plus, he has this whole universe to see all these supernovas. I don't know what boredom. But even if the universe was boring to him, as I could definitely conceive of, given he's infinite, he could just choose not to be bored, given he's all powerful and all knowing. He could just know how to not be bored and just make himself not bored. And if he can do that without harming anything, because he's all powerful, of course. As for admiring, the thing with God, right, is he's all knowing. I mean, he already knows how everything would turn out. And I do get the idea of admiring, given he keeps saying how good things are, and he's happy with all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But God knows that things won't last, and he could have made them last. He's all powerful, he's all knowing. He knows that very quickly, incredibly quickly, things are not going to go to plan. Or, really, things will go to plan, and they are going to vastly contradict what his stated want in creation was. So, I can see the admiration angle, but I don't know if that would be rest as much as inactivity, right? I don't know if you could really classify anything as rest in the nature of God. And then, of course, if God is now guiding evolution or guiding cosmology or doing many of the other things people say God guides, like, oh yeah, God help me find my car keys, or God answer my prayer. I mean, is he resting? Is resting an absolute zero of activity, not just relative but total? Or does resting just mean less than now, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I feel like this is more a language issue.
I mean, it might be, right? Which
Yeah.
clarifying terms is important. Like, which language do you think we should clarify? Like the term rest, or
Yeah.
okay, what would you define as rest? Divine, or let's say otherwise?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, there's different meanings of it.
This kind of goes back to what I was saying about how human language is
Yeah.
a construct.
No, like I just thought of that.
Yeah. Right. So this very examples like, hey, why is God using language? And here we are in a situation where you might be thinking one thing, I might be thinking another. We don't even know if we're thinking the same thing. It could be that the disconnect is not on the word rest, but on something else. I'm using rest not to mean like sleep. I don't think either of us are using the sleep. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm using rest merely to refer to a lack of activity, just a casual, I guess, lounging about, for lack of a better term, right? And I just don't know how I could say anything is more or less exertion to God. Like, for me, if I'm resting, like a couple weeks ago, I wasn't working on this project, and I took a rest and I painted and I did other things, and it still took a lot of effort, but I considered it to an extent a rest because I was, doing something different, right? But for God, I can't see how. I mean, rest would be something he'd ever desire, given his infinite nature, or something that could necessarily be applied to him in the human concept, right? I think that may be even the issue, not even the definition of rest, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I do strongly disagree with the board, but I could say, yeah, he's just admiring what he's seeing, and he's just having a great time looking at it, right?
Yeah.
I could see that. I don't think I agree with it, but I can see the interpretation, right? I do think there are issues, but then again, I can't necessarily say what God would want to do, right?
Yeah.
But I do like the board. All right, cool. And then Rubik's Cube, are you here or you just like mute yourself and just leave?
Yeah, I'm chilling.
Just chilling out.
Like the snack.
Just like the snack. It hasn't happened yet, so it's a reference people
Oh,
will
for
get.
sure.
Well, I guess it has happened, but as for this recording, it hasn't. Okay, cool. So I think we'll finish up there, and we'll get to
Yep.
Genesis 2 tomorrow, and then after that we'll get to Genesis 9.5, but that's another show. Okay, cool. See you guys.
Okay.
Just get the